The royal palace of Aethelgard was a monument of stone and sorrow. Rain lashed against the leaded glass windows of the queen's chambers, each drop a frantic tap against the silence of the dying. Queen Elara, once the vibrant heart of the kingdom, lay shriveled amidst linens of the finest silk, her breath a shallow, rattling thing. The air was thick with the cloying scent of beeswax and bitter medicine. In the shadowed corner, away from the cluster of physicians and weeping ladies-in-waiting, stood Callum. His hands, usually stained with earth and calloused from the careful work of tending the palace roses, were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He felt like a weed in a hothouse of orchids, a Scottish gardener summoned to the monarch's deathbed for reasons he could not fathom. King Alastair stood rigidly by the fireplace, his face a granite mask of grief, his gaze fixed on the wife he was losing. It was then that the queen's eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with pain, but a sudden, startling clarity sharpened her gaze. It swept past the king, past the courtiers, and landed directly on Callum. A frail, trembling hand emerged from the blankets, its finger pointing at him. The room held its breath. The only sound was the frantic hammering of Callum's own heart against his ribs. "My son," she whispered, the words a dry leaf carried on a final breath. "My true son." The silence that followed was more deafening than any thunder. A physician dropped a silver bowl. It clattered across the marble floor, a discordant chime that seemed to shatter the world. King Alastair's head snapped toward Callum, his eyes widening from grief into pure, uncomprehending shock. Callum felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. The word son echoed in the hollow of his chest, a key turning in a lock he never knew existed. He saw not the queen but the face of the kind, simple Scottish woman who had raised him, who had told him his father was a guardsman who died with honor. It was a lie, a beautiful, protective lie. The queen's hand fell back onto the bed, her life extinguished. But the bomb she had detonated in that room was only just beginning to explode. All eyes were on Callum, the dirt-stained gardener, the hidden heir, the living, breathing secret that now threatened to topple a kingdom. The grandeur of the throne room felt like a cage. Callum stood alone on the vast, intricate carpet, his worn boots starkly out of place. He was still in his gardening clothes, the scent of rain and soil clinging to him, a humble fragrance amidst the oppressive perfume of power and polish. Before him, on the twin thrones of Aethelgard, sat King Alastair. The initial shock on the king's face had been replaced by a cold, simmering fury. To his right stood Prince Ronan, the man who had, until an hour ago, been the undisputed heir to the throne. Ronan's expression was one of pure, undiluted hatred, his jaw so tight it looked carved from marble. "Explain this," the king's voice boomed, not a request, but a command that vibrated through the very stone. "I cannot, your majesty," Callum said, his voice low but steady, his Scottish accent thickening with stress. "I knew nothing of this. My mother, the woman I knew as my mother, she told me a different story." "A story to hide a bastard," Ronan spat, taking a step forward. "A story to protect a whore's secret." A hot flush of anger rose up Callum's neck. "Do not speak of her that way." "Why?" Ronan sneered. "Because she was a queen, she was weak. She couldn't bear a healthy heir, so she foisted her sickly, trueborn son on some peasant to save him from the viper's nest of court and presented a robust, adopted stranger as her own to the kingdom." He gestured to himself. "Me. She used me as a shield, a placeholder. And you," his eyes raked over Callum's simple attire, "you were the treasure she hid away." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Callum looked at the king. "Is this true?" King Alastair's face was a landscape of torment. "There were threats. A stillborn child before you. Elara was terrified. She believed the court was poisoned against her, that a true heir would not survive." He looked at Ronan with a pained mixture of duty and distance. "She found an orphan of noble, distant blood. We presented him as our own, and she sent you away to a woman she trusted implicitly to keep you safe until the crown was secure." "And now she's ruined it all," Ronan hissed. "She couldn't even die without causing chaos." Callum's world had been dismantled. He was not a gardener who had stumbled into royalty. He was a prince who had been hidden in the soil, a seed planted in secret. The parents he had loved were guardians. The king, this stern, grieving man, was his father, and the man glowering at him was a stranger who had lived his life, a prince who now saw him as the thief of his destiny. Callum was given chambers fit for a prince, yet they felt like the most elaborate prison he could imagine. Silk hangings replaced rough-hewn timber, the soft give of Persian rugs underfoot felt alien compared to the solid earth. He was assigned a valet, a man named Fergus whose face was a permanent mask of disapproval, and a guard, a stoic man-at-arms named Gareth, whose true purpose was clearly to be his jailer. His first lesson in courtly life was a disaster. A dancing master tried to teach him the intricate steps of a pavane. Callum's body, used to the strong, purposeful movements of digging and pruning, was clumsy and uncooperative. The whispers and titters from the watching courtiers were like a swarm of gnats, incessant and humiliating. Perhaps he would prefer to waltz with a shovel, a voice drawled from the doorway. Prince Ronan leaned against the frame, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was accompanied by Lady Genevieve, a vision in sapphire blue silk, her dark hair coiled in an intricate style that seemed to mock Callum's own unruly curls. Genevieve's eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over him. There was no warmth in them, only a cool, analytical curiosity. She was the daughter of the powerful Duke of Northwood, and rumored to be Ronan's intended. "The soil does not judge one's footwork, your highness," Callum replied, meeting Ronan's gaze and refusing to look away. "It only asks for honest labor." Ronan's smile vanished. "Honest labor? You are a political crisis in rough-spun wool. Your very existence is a lie that threatens to plunge this kingdom into civil war. There is nothing honest about you." He strode away, Genevieve following in his wake. But as she passed, her gaze lingered on Callum for a moment longer, and he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not pity, but something more akin to intrigue. That night, unable to sleep, Callum slipped past a dozing gareth and found his way to the one place that felt like home, the royal gardens. The scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine was a balm. He knelt by a rose bush, his fingers instinctively checking the soil, pruning a dead leaf. Here, he was not a secret heir or a political pawn. He was just a man, connected to the enduring, simple truth of the earth. A soft footfall on the gravel path made him turn. It was Lady Genevieve, wrapped in a velvet cloak, her face pale in the moonlight. "You should not be here, my lady," he said, rising to his feet. "And you should be in your chambers, your highness," she countered, her voice quiet. "They say you are a disruption, a danger." "And what do you say?" She looked at the rose bush, then at his soil-stained hands. "I say that a man who understands growth cannot be entirely a danger, but you must understand, to them, you are not a person. You are a problem to be solved." She hesitated. "And Prince Ronan does not like his problems to remain unsolved for long." With that cryptic warning, she melted back into the shadows, leaving Callum alone with the roses and a growing sense of dread. The royal council was a den of wolves. Seated around the ancient oak table were the most powerful men in the kingdom, the stern lord commander of the army, the shrewd master of coin, and the deeply pious high bishop, his face a roadmap of disapproval. King Alastair presided, looking older and wearier than Callum had ever seen him. Prince Ronan sat to his right, the picture of regal assurance. "The situation is untenable, your majesty," the master of coin began, steepling his fingers. "The northern lords are questioning the line of succession. They whisper that a child of Scottish blood, raised in common mud, is unfit to rule Aethelgard. The church cannot bless a crown whose legitimacy is shrouded in the sin of deception." The high bishop intoned, his eyes fixed on Callum as if he were a stain on the divine right of kings. Callum stood, feeling their gazes like physical weights. "I did not ask for this," he said, his voice cutting through the stuffy air. "I was content with my life. I ask only for the truth." "The truth," Ronan laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The truth is that you are a weakness. Aethelgard needs a strong, unified king, not a gardener who speaks of honest labor while noblemen plot to carve up the kingdom." "Strength is not only found in a sword," Callum retorted, his temper fraying. "It is found in the roots of an oak that withstands a storm. It is in the patience required to make something grow from nothing. What do any of you know of true creation? You only know how to wield what others have built." A stunned silence followed his outburst. He had not just challenged Ronan, he had challenged the very foundation of their power. Later, seeking solace, he walked the high battlements. The wind whipped at his hair, carrying the scent of the distant sea. He heard footsteps and turned, expecting Gareth, or perhaps another courtier sent to spy. It was Genevieve. The wind caught her cloak, billowing it out behind her like a dark sail. "Your words in the council chamber were either very brave or very foolish," she said, coming to stand beside him. She gazed out over the kingdom, the sprawling city, the fertile river valley, the dark line of the forest beyond. "They were the truth," he said simply. "At court, truth is the most dangerous weapon of all," she replied. "Ronan will not forget it." She turned to him, her expression earnest. "You see this land as a garden, Callum. You see its potential for growth, for beauty. But Ronan, he sees it as a possession, a thing to be controlled, to be owned, and he believes you are trying to steal it from him. I don't want to steal anything. It does not matter what you want, she said softly. It only matters what you represent. You are a seed of doubt sown in the mind of the kingdom, and Ronan will stop at nothing to pluck you out before you can take root. For the first time he saw a crack in her cool facade. He saw fear. And in that moment, the connection between them shifted from one of curiosity to one of shared, silent understanding in the face of a gathering storm. The first open attack came not with a sword but with a lie. Callum was in the library, attempting to decipher a dusty tome on Aethelgardian law when the doors burst open. Lord Commander Valerius strode in, his face like thunder, followed by a contingent of guards. "Prince Callum," he boomed, his voice echoing in the hushed space. "You are accused of treasonous correspondence with the Scottish clans across the border." Callum stood, his heart sinking. "That is a lie." "Is it?" Ronan emerged from behind the guards, holding a piece of parchment. "We intercepted this. It speaks of the rightful king returning to claim his throne and promises Scottish support in exchange for lands. It bears your seal." Callum stared at the document. The seal was a crude but passable imitation of the royal signet he had only recently been granted. The accusation was absurd, yet terrifyingly plausible. A Scottish-born heir conspiring with his mother's people. The court would believe it in an instant. "I have written no such letter," Callum stated, his voice cold. "Then how do you explain this?" Ronan pressed, his eyes gleaming with triumph. It was then that Genevieve, who had been quietly reading in an alcove, stepped forward. "My lords," she said, her voice calm and clear. "If I may, the parchment. It is of a northern mill's make, is it not? The one that supplies the royal guard's barracks. I recognize the watermark. It seems an odd choice for a prince with access to the royal stationery." A flicker of uncertainty passed through the Lord Commander's eyes. He took the parchment and examined it more closely. Ronan's smug expression tightened into a mask of fury directed at Genevieve. "The lady is observant," the Lord Commander grunted. "The matter requires further investigation." He turned and marched out, the guards following, the confrontation deflated. In the sudden quiet, Ronan took a step toward Genevieve. "You would side with this soil sifter against your future king." "I side with the truth, my prince," she replied, not backing down. "Or have we abandoned that as a principle of the crown?" Ronan's gaze was venomous. He looked from her to Callum, then turned on his heel and left, the silence he left behind more threatening than any shout. "Thank you," Callum breathed, his legs feeling weak. "Do not thank me," Genevieve whispered, her own composure shaken. "I have only made him more dangerous. You see now what he is capable of. That letter was just the first frost. It is meant to wither you, to make the court turn against you. He will not stop." She was right. The gilded cage was beginning to show its bars, and they were sharpened to a point. The idyllic dream of discovering his birthright had vanished, replaced by the brutal reality of a fight for his very life. In the days that followed the failed accusation, a fragile, unspoken alliance formed between Callum and Genevieve. They began to meet in the gardens at twilight, in the hidden arbor where the white moonflowers bloomed. It was a neutral territory, away from the prying eyes and listening ears of the palace. He found himself telling her things he had told no one, stories of his childhood in the Scottish Highlands, of the woman he called mother, of the simple rhythms of a life governed by seasons, not conspiracies. He spoke of the ache he felt for the feel of real earth, not the manicured perfection of the palace grounds. "It's all control here," he said one evening, gesturing to the perfectly symmetrical hedges. "Every branch is forced into place. There is no wildness, no freedom." "Freedom is a luxury kings cannot afford," Genevieve replied, her fingers tracing the velvety petal of a flower. "My entire life has been a lesson in control. How to speak, how to walk, who to marry for the betterment of my family's name." "And do you wish for that marriage?" he asked, the question hanging heavily between them. She looked away, toward the illuminated windows of the palace. "My wishes are like these flowers. They only matter if they are pleasing to the one who owns the garden." Her words struck a chord of profound sadness in him. They were both prisoners, bound by different chains. He was learning the language of court, but she was teaching him the language of the heart, and he found it infinitely more complex. One afternoon, he took her to a part of the garden the royal gardeners neglected, a wild, sunny slope where he had secretly begun to cultivate a patch of heather and thistle, plants from his homeland. "This is you," she said, understanding dawning in her eyes as she looked at the hardy, beautiful, untamed plants thriving against the odds. This is what you bring to this stone prison. Not a threat, but a different kind of strength. He knelt and pulled a small, stubborn weed from between the heather, his touch gentle. A gardener does not see a weed as an enemy. He sees it as a plant growing where it is not wanted. Sometimes, the solution is not to rip it out but to understand why it thrives there. Perhaps the soil is poor for the roses but perfect for something else. He looked up at her and the metaphor hung in the air, vast and unspoken. He was the weed in Ronan's perfect garden. But in her eyes he saw that she was beginning to see the value in what a weed could represent. Resilience, adaptation, a fierce will to live. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, their hands brushed as they walked back to the palace. The touch was electric, a silent confession in the growing darkness. The political game continued around them, but in the quiet sanctuary of the garden, something else was taking root, something as tender and vulnerable as a new spring shoot, and just as perilous. The king's health began to fail. The physicians whispered of a broken heart, but Callum saw the haunted look in Alistair's eyes and knew it was more. A soul crushed under the weight of a terrible secret, and the impending war between the two sons he never knew he had. Ronan's influence grew as the king waned. He began to make pronouncements to move troops to act as a ruler in all but name. The court, sensing the shift in power, flocked to him like moths to a flame. Callum felt his position becoming more precarious by the hour. His few allies were too fearful to speak openly. Only Gareth, his guard, had shown him a grudging respect, and Genevieve, whose stolen moments with him became the only light in the encroaching darkness. One evening, a formal dinner was held in the great hall. It was a display of Ronan's power, a pageant of loyalty he demanded from his courtiers. Callum was seated far from the high table, a deliberate insult. He picked at his food, the rich sauces and spiced meats tasting of ash. Genevieve, seated near Ronan, looked pale and strained. Halfway through the meal, she suddenly stood, her hand flying to her throat. A strangled gasp escaped her lips before she crumpled to the floor. Chaos erupted. Callum was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. He pushed through the stunned crowd and knelt beside her. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow. A half-empty goblet of wine lay spilled beside her. "Do not touch her," Ronan commanded, descending from the high table, his face a mask of theatrical concern. "It could be a plague. Guards, restrain him." But Callum ignored him. His gardener's instincts took over. He picked up her goblet, sniffing the dregs of the wine. Beneath the scent of oak and grape, there was a faint, bitter almond note he recognized from a poisonous plant he'd once been warned to eradicate from the gardens. Wolfsbane. "It's not a plague," Callum said, his voice cutting through the panic. He looked directly at Ronan, his eyes blazing. "It's poison." The word silenced the hall. "Preposterous," Ronan blustered, but a flicker of fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Fetch the royal physician, now," Callum roared, an authority in his voice no one had heard before. He looked at Gareth, who stood frozen nearby. "You, help me get her to her chambers." As they carried her unconscious form from the hall, the court's eyes were not on Ronan but on Callum. They had seen the decisive, calm strength of a leader in a crisis. They had seen Ronan's panic, and they had heard the accusation hang in the air, unproven but terrifyingly plausible. The target had shifted. Ronan had not been trying to frame Callum this time. He had been trying to remove the one person who had dared to stand beside him, and in doing so, he had revealed his true, ruthless nature to the entire court. The battle was no longer just about a crown. It was now, undeniably, a fight for Genevieve's life. Genevieve's chambers became a vigil. Callum refused to leave her side despite the scandalized whispers. He dismissed her ladies-in-waiting and with a fierceness that brooked no argument took charge of her care. He used his knowledge of herbs, working alongside the skeptical royal physician, preparing poultices and antidotes from the palace gardens, his hands, so often mocked, now her best hope for survival. For 3 days and 3 nights he kept watch. He spoke to her of the Scottish moors in spring, of the heather that turned the hills purple, of the fierce, clean wind that carried the scent of pine and possibility. He told her of the life he had dreamed of, a simple life that now felt a universe away. He confessed, to her unconscious form, the feelings he dared not speak when she was awake. On the 4th morning her fever broke. Her eyes fluttered open, finding his, red-rimmed and weary from his vigil. "You," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. A sob of relief caught in Callum's throat. He simply nodded, squeezing her hand. The story of his vigil spread through the palace like wildfire. The gardener prince had saved the duke's daughter where the court physicians had faltered. He had shown a devotion that was not political, but profoundly human. The court, which valued spectacle above all, was deeply moved. Ronan's calculated power plays began to look cheap and hollow in comparison. But Ronan was not defeated. He was cornered, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. He found Callum in the garden, by the now famous moonflower arbor. The pretense of civility was gone. "You think you've won something?" Ronan snarled, his face contorted with rage. "You have won the affection of a fickle court and a poisoned girl. I hold the army. I hold the treasury. I hold the loyalty of every lord who matters." "You tried to kill her," Callum said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I tried to remove a complication," Ronan corrected him. "She was mine, my alliance, my key to securing the northern dukedoms. And you grubby little plant, you stole her loyalty, just as you are trying to steal my crown." "It was never your crown," Callum said, standing his ground. "It was a shield you were given, and you have used it to bludgeon everyone around you. A true king serves his people, he does not own them." Ronan let out a short, ugly laugh. "Spare me your peasant philosophy. There is one final play on the board, brother. The king is dying. When he draws his last breath, the crown will pass to his named heir. And he named me." He leaned in close, his breath hot against Callum's face. "And my first act as king will be to sign a warrant for your execution for the attempted murder of Lady Genevieve. I have witnesses who will swear they saw you tamper with her wine." Callum stared at him, the sheer, brazen evil of the plan leaving him cold. Ronan had orchestrated the poisoning not just to remove Genevieve, but to create the perfect trap for him. "No one will believe it," Callum said, but the words felt weak. "They will believe what their king tells them to believe," Ronan whispered. "Enjoy your gardens, Callum. They will be the last beautiful thing you ever see." He strode away, leaving Callum standing alone in the arbor, the sweet scent of the moonflowers suddenly smelling of decay. The final, deadly frost was coming, and this time it threatened to kill everything. The summons came in the dead of night. King Alistair was fatting fast. Callum entered the royal bedchamber to find it lit by a single candle, the shadows dancing like specters on the walls. The king was a ghost of his former self, his skin translucent over bone. Ronan was already there, standing at the foot of the bed, his expression one of barely concealed impatience. The high bishop stood nearby, holding the royal seal. "My sons," the king rasped, his eyes moving between them filled with a bottomless regret. "I have failed you both. I failed Elara. I allowed fear to dictate my life, and in doing so I have sown the seeds of destruction for my kingdom." He beckoned Callum closer. His hand, when it grasped Callum's, was shockingly cold. "You have your mother's heart," he whispered, tears glistening in his eyes. "You see the world as it could be, not just as it is. That is a gift I never possessed." He drew a ragged breath. "Ronan has the strength of a king but the heart of a tyrant. Aethelgard cannot survive him." Ronan stiffened, his face darkening. "Father." "Silence," the king commanded with a surprising burst of strength. He looked at Callum, his gaze intense, pleading. "The crown is yours by blood and by right. You must take it. Save our people from the winter he would bring." He gestured weakly to the high bishop. "The decree, the true decree." The high bishop, his face pale, unrolled a small scroll. "By the command of King Alistair, the line of succession passes to his natural-born son, Callum, upon his death." Ronan made a sound like a wounded animal. "That paper is worthless. The official decree names me. The council has seen it. The army will never follow a piece of paper signed by a dying man." The king's head fell back onto the pillows, his strength spent. His eyes remained fixed on Callum, a final, silent plea. And then the light within them went out. The king was dead. In the profound silence that followed, the only sound was the crackling of the candle. Callum looked from his father's peaceful face to his brother's enraged one. He had not wanted a crown. He had only wanted the truth. But now the truth had been laid upon him like a mantle of iron. It was no longer about his birthright or his safety or even his love for Genevieve. It was about a kingdom. It was about his father's last command. He was no longer Callum the gardener, or Callum the secret heir. He was Callum the king, and his brother was the first, greatest threat to his realm. Chaos descended with the dawn. The palace became a fortress divided. Ronan, with the Lord Commander's support, controlled the barracks, the gates, and the treasury. He had himself proclaimed king in the great hall, using the old decree before the new one could be made public. Callum's supporters were fewer but fiercely loyal. Gareth, his guard, rallied a contingent of the palace watch who had been swayed by Callum's character. A handful of younger lords, disillusioned with Ronan's brutality, pledged their swords. They barricaded themselves in the oldest wing of the palace, the King's Keep, its thick stone walls their only advantage. The first assault came at midday. Ronan's guards battered at the great oak doors of the keep with a ram. Arrows flew through narrow windows. It was not a battle of armies, but a desperate, bloody skirmish in hallways where they had once danced. Callum fought not with the polished skill of a knight, but with the raw, determined strength of a man defending his home. He used his knowledge of the palace's hidden passages and servants' corridors, leading small, disruptive sorties that confused and delayed Ronan's forces. He was not a brilliant strategist, but he was a stubborn defender, his connection to this stone-and-mortar world giving him a resilience that surprised everyone. In a quiet moment, his tunic stained with soot and blood, he found Genevieve in the great hall of the keep, tending to the wounded. She had recovered her strength and with it, a steely resolve. "You should be in the vaults where it's safe," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "There is no safe," she replied, not looking up from the bandage she was tying. "There is only where I am needed, and I am needed here, with you." Their eyes met, and in that glance, amidst the chaos of a civil war, an entire future was promised. She was not a prize to be won, but a partner in the struggle. She believed in the king he was becoming, not the one he was born to be. The fighting raged for 2 days. They were running low on food, water, and hope. Ronan's forces had them surrounded, a noose tightening with every hour. On the evening of the second day, Callum stood on the battlements, looking down at the ring of torches that surrounded them. He felt the weight of his failure. He had tried to be a different kind of king, a king of roots and growth, and it had led them here to a slow death by siege. But as he gazed out, he saw a flicker of movement in the dark forest beyond the palace walls. Then another and another. Torches, hundreds of them emerging from the tree line, not the ordered ranks of an army but a scattered, determined host. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and woodsmen, the people of the city and the surrounding villages. They had heard the story of the gardener prince, the king who had knelt in the dirt to save a noble lady, the son of their beloved Queen Elara. They had seen Ronan's cruelty, and they had chosen their side. They carried scythes, axes, and hunting bows. They had no uniforms, no discipline, but they had a righteous fury. They fell upon Ronan's besieging forces from the rear with a chaotic, overwhelming force. The people had not waited for a king to save them. They had risen to save their king. The seed of an idea, sown in a garden and nurtured with honesty, had finally borne fruit. The siege was broken not by an army, but by a kingdom. The final confrontation took place not on a grand battlefield, but in the throne room, now littered with the debris of the short, brutal war. Ronan stood alone before the twin thrones, his fine clothes torn, his face a mask of sweaty, desperate fury. His army had melted away. His allies had surrendered or fled. The will of the people had proven to be a force he could not command or crush. Callum entered, accompanied by Gareth and a few of his loyal guards. He was weary to his bones, but his gaze was steady. "It's over, Ronan," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Nothing is over," Ronan screamed, drawing his sword. The blade gleamed in the light. "This is mine. It was always mine. I earned it. I played their game. I followed their rules. You just crawled out of the dirt." "The strongest trees grow from the dirt, brother," Callum replied quietly. He did not draw his own weapon. "You saw the kingdom as a thing to be possessed, but it is a living thing. It is a garden, and you cannot command a garden to grow. You can only nurture it, protect it, and sometimes have the wisdom to let it grow wild." "I will not hear your peasant proverbs," Ronan lunged. The fight was short and brutal. Ronan was a trained duelist, his movements precise and deadly. Callum was a brawler, his style unrefined but powerful, born of a life of physical labor. He parried and dodged, not seeking to kill, but to disarm, to end it. The end came when Ronan, in a wild, overhand swing, overbalanced. Callum stepped inside his guard and slammed the pommel of his own sword into Ronan's wrist. The bone cracked, and Ronan's sword clattered to the floor. He fell to his knees, clutching his broken hand, defeated not just by a man, but by an idea he could never comprehend. Callum looked down at him, not with triumph but with a profound sadness. "You were raised as a prince, but you never learned the first duty of a king, to love his people more than he loves his crown." He turned to Gareth. Take him to the North Tower. He will be held there under guard for the rest of his days." As Ronan was led away, weeping with rage and pain, Callum turned to face the thrones. The court, what was left of it, had begun to filter into the room, their eyes upon him. The High Bishop, the Master of Coin, the lords and ladies, all waited. He did not immediately ascend the dais. Instead, he walked to a window and looked out at the gardens, at the people still gathered beyond the palace gates. Then he turned back to them. "The crown is not a prize," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "It is a responsibility. It is not about blood, but about service. From this day forward, this kingdom will be a garden where every person has the right to grow, to thrive, and to be heard." He finally walked to the throne, but he did not sit. He placed his hand on the carved wood, a gesture of stewardship, not ownership. The coronation that followed was unlike any in Aethelgard's history. It was held not just in the cathedral, but in the great courtyard, where the common people could witness it. And when the High Bishop placed the heavy, golden crown on his head, Callum felt its weight, but he did not bow beneath it. Later, in the Moonflower Arbor, now a symbol of their love and the resistance that had saved the kingdom, he found Genevieve. The official crown was gone, and in his hands, he held a simple, beautifully crafted circlet of living wood, intertwined with heather and white roses. "A crown of living wood for a king of a living kingdom," he said softly, "and for the queen who will walk beside him." He did not ask her to marry him for an alliance or for power. He simply held out the crown, an offering of his heart. Tears shone in Genevieve's winter sky eyes as she looked from the humble, beautiful circlet to the man she loved. "A crown that grows," she whispered, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes." The first year of King Callum's reign was not marked by grand wars or lavish tournaments, but by a quiet, determined revolution. He opened the palace gardens to the people one day a week, a symbolic gesture that the beauty and bounty of the kingdom belonged to all. He walked among the market stalls, not with a heavy guard, but with Genevieve by his side, listening to the grievances and ideas of his people. He reformed the tax codes, easing the burden on farmers and artisans. He established a council that included not just nobles, but elected representatives from the guilds and the major towns. The court, initially skeptical, slowly began to adapt. The air in the palace changed. It was less a perfumed tomb and more a living, breathing heart of a nation. His wedding to Genevieve was a celebration that spilled from the cathedral into the streets. There was no political maneuvering, only genuine joy. The people cheered for their gardener king and his queen, who had seen the man beneath the soil and the crown. Ronan remained in the North Tower. Callum visited him once, offering not condemnation but a chance for redemption. Ronan had only stared out the window, his bitterness a cage stronger than any stone. Callum left, saddened but resolved, understanding that some things once withered could not be revived. One afternoon, Callum and Genevieve stood on the wild slope where his Scottish heather and thistle grew, now a thriving, celebrated part of the royal gardens. "It is strange," he said, taking her hand. "I spent my life feeling like I didn't belong. I was a Scottish seedling in an English garden, a prince in a gardener's body, but now I see it was the perfect preparation. A gardener knows that the most beautiful landscapes are often the most diverse. That strength comes from deep roots, not from being forced into a shape you were never meant to hold." Genevieve leaned her head against his shoulder. "You did not just claim a throne, Callum. You planted a new idea of what a kingdom can be, and it is growing." He looked out over his realm, not with the pride of ownership but with the loving care of a steward. The harvest was still to come, but the fields were sown with hope, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked not like a burden, but like a promise of spring. Years later, on a bright morning, King Callum walked through the bustling royal gardens. His step was still that of a man who knew the feel of the earth, though the crown of living wood on his head had been reinforced with a band of silver, a symbol of the enduring strength of his reign. He was not alone. Beside him, her small hand tucked securely in his, was a little girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's thoughtful green eyes. Princess Elara, named for the grandmother whose secret had set this all in motion. "Papa, look," Elara squealed, pointing to a vibrant, unruly patch of purple heather. "It's spreading." Callum knelt, his kingly robes pooling in the rich soil. He didn't mind the dirt. "It is," he said, a smile in his voice. "It found a place it likes, and it's making the garden stronger, more beautiful, just like you." From a nearby path, Queen Genevieve watched them, a soft smile on her face. In her arms she cradled their newborn son, a boy who would one day inherit not just a crown, but a philosophy. The kingdom of Aethelgard was thriving. It was not the richest or the most feared nation, but it was known for its justice, its compassion, and the unique partnership between its monarchs and its people. The story of the Gardener King had become a legend, a bedtime story told to children about how truth and love could conquer even the deepest deceit. Callum plucked a single, perfect white rose and handed it to his daughter. He looked from her bright, curious face to his wife's loving gaze, and then out over the palace walls to the green, peaceful land beyond. He had come from the soil, a hidden seed. He had weathered storms of betrayal and the bitter frost of hatred, but he had been nurtured by truth, by love, and by the faith of a people. And now he was not just a king upon a throne, but the sturdy, life-giving trunk of a family in a kingdom that would, he knew, continue to grow and blossom for generations to come. The secret heir was a secret no more. He was simply a man, a father, a husband, a gardener, and in that he had found his true crown.